I used to do highway patrol as part of my duties for the sheriff's department. Most of the time, it was sitting around for hours, waiting for something to happen. In my early years, I would work the graveyard shifts. One night, a little after midnight, someone sped past me going over 85. I turned my lights on and pulled him over. He pulled over to the side pretty easily. He even did this thing where he turned on his interior light and put his hands on the wheel. With the advent of the internet, more people are doing this. Most law enforcement love seeing people do this because it shows clearly where their hands are. I assumed he was just trying to be a goody two-shoes so he could get out of a speeding ticket. I typed the license plate into my MDC. That's the computer we use in our patrol cars. Fairly standard information came up for the license plate. I was confident this would be a routine speeding ticket. I had already decided that as long as they didn't throw a tantrum, I'd mark the ticket as only going 75. It would cut the fine in half. I got out of the car, put a hand on my flashlight and a hand on my gun, like I always do. My focus was locked on the car, a little four-door early 2000s car. I remember how plain and smooth the car looked. A car door closed. It made my skin tighten. It wasn't the car I pulled over. I could clearly see everything going on with that car. I was expecting another car had pulled up behind mine. There wasn't. By the way, don't ever pull up behind a police car. It would have terrified me and made me feel surrounded. One of my biggest fears about pulling someone over is that someone else would pull up behind me and catch me by surprise. But what actually happened was weirder. The noise came from my passenger side door. It was dark, so I really didn't get a good look at them, but there was a woman in my passenger seat. I took a glance at the car I pulled over. The guy hadn't moved, so I walked back toward my car. The woman was wearing a highway patrol uniform. I didn't call for backup. Why would I? This was just a simple speeding ticket. She didn't look like anyone I worked with either. "Hello?" I called out. She moved a little in the shadows, but didn't respond back. My window was open. I liked the fresh air, so I leaned down. It was like I was pulling over my own car. "What are you doing in my vehicle?" I asked. "He's got a gun with him," she spoke. "What? Who?" I asked. "He's got a gun with him," she said again. "On the seat next to him." I opened the door, expecting the lights to turn on, and I'd get a good look at the woman. But when it came on, she was gone. She vanished into thin air. Nothing will make you feel safe after seeing someone disappear like that. It doesn't matter how much training you have or how fast you can pull a sidearm out of its holster. I was really spooked, but I still had to do my job. I could still see the man's hands nicely perched on his steering wheel. "Sir, I'm going to need your license and registration," I spoke. Standard stuff. The best way to keep a situation calm is to look calm and act calm. He reached over into his glove compartment and grabbed his paperwork. On the seat next to him was a hoodie, and peeking out under the hoodie was the butt of a gun. Just like the woman had said. When he saw my lights, he probably grabbed the hoodie to hide the gun. He was still calm. I wanted to get him away from the weapon. "Sir, we've had a lot of trouble with drunk drivers this time of night. I'm going to have you get out of the car and touch your nose a couple of times for me." "I haven't been drinking," he said. "Then this will be quick," I said. He got out, and I closed the door for him. I was putting further separation between him and the gun. "Do you have a concealed carry license for the weapon in your car?" I asked. He responded with, "What weapon?" I'm a state police patrolman. I cover a lot of area during my patrols, but it is typically more on the highways than the back roads. Still, I like to think I was fairly familiar with most of the areas I was assigned to cover. It often happens a case will cross county lines, and paperwork is needed in both places. Usually, I would start out on patrol, and if any paperwork needed to be taken to another county, I would work it into my patrols. In a minimal effort to avoid paperwork, I would also use these days to take the road less traveled. Enjoy the scenery, if you will. I remember it was July 23rd, 2009, and I was on patrol. I was on my way to the barracks to deliver paperwork. Of course, I took the less traveled route. While en route, everything flashed on my unit, and my car stalled. This was turning into a long day. Fortunately, I was able to coast and steer the car into an old washed-out driveway off the county road I was traveling on. Coasting into the driveway, I saw an older gentleman walk out by the barn. He looked my way but kept walking and went into the barn. In the moment, I remember thinking it was a little odd that he hadn't even waved or looked startled. He just kept right on about his business. By now, I was getting worked up and frustrated with the unit's lack of power. I tried to get it started, but it was done. I tried a few more times, praying to hear anything that could give an indication of what was wrong. I wasn't going to solve this mess on my own. Next step, contact dispatch. After trying to reach dispatch on the radio with no luck, I knew then my handheld was useless, unless I could somehow manage to get far enough away to prevent interference. My patrol unit and all the equipment inside were next to useless at this point, which only added to my frustration. The next best option was to use the farmer's phone since I couldn't get a call signal either. Everything at my immediate disposal was down. I needed to establish contact with dispatch. For the first time since unwillingly arriving at this old farm, I stepped out of the car and looked around. There was an old white farmhouse at the end of the driveway. The paint looked like it needed a new coat or two, but seemed well maintained. There was an ancient-looking wooden rocking chair gently swaying in the evening breeze. I hadn't noticed the old farmer leaving the barn and assumed he must still be inside. The barn was as old as the house and a classic red color. It too needed a new coat of paint and was obviously still functional. It smelled of cows and fresh thrown hay. I headed out towards the barn where the old man had presumably gone inside and got to work. I hollered, "Hello?" Listened for a reply, and then opened what turned out to be the door of the milking parlor. I remember thinking, it seems awfully quiet in here, before looking around the milking parlor as I stood in the doorway. I didn't see the old man or hear him, so I hollered, "Hello?" for the second time, but a little louder than before. Still not hearing anything, I decided to head back and try the house. I thought maybe I missed him going inside when I was messing with my phone. But as I turned around, he was standing behind me. I'll admit, turning around and about running into a stern-looking old man startled me a little. I hadn't heard or seen where he came from. I could have sworn he was inside the barn. But to be behind me, he had to have come from outside. At the time, this was not the first thought that came to mind. Honestly, I was glad to have found him and could finally ask to borrow his phone. The man had no expression on his weathered face when he asked, "Are you having car trouble?" His voice was hollow, like life had got the best of him, but he was still here doing his best to live it. "Yes, sir, I am. Darn thing is dead as a doornail. I can't even use the radio inside it. Would you mind if I used your phone?" I looked into his eyes and spoke to him like I had been raised to do. He had lonely, pale blue eyes and a face that was creased with wrinkles he probably took on too young. He was tall and still looked as strong as an ox. The years had not been kind to him, but he seemed to be making the most of it. At first, he pointed up to the house. "We can walk up there." Then he looked back at me. "Or you can use the one in the milking parlor, just as long as you won't be but a minute. I'm fixing to start milking." He took a step towards the barn, anxious to get to his milking, but then stopped, as if remembering some long-forgotten courtesy. "Do you want some water?" "Some water would be great. Thank you, sir. And the parlor phone will work. I shouldn't be long at all." He nodded, walked around me, and headed back inside the barn. I followed him into the old red barn and back into the milking parlor. There was an old phone mounted on the wall inside the shop next to the doorframe and light switch. Seeing me reach for the phone, the old farmer walked back out of the barn. I dialed the number to dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Officer." I went on to describe what had happened to my unit, my location, and I was going to need a wrecker. As I listened to their response and did some more explaining, the farmer came back and handed me a glass of water. He then walked in the direction of his milking machines. Dispatch quickly let me know that they would have a wrecker out to my location in under 60 minutes. "Thank you, Dispatch." I put the old-fashioned phone back on its jack. Just as I had the phone back on its jack, the farmer came back towards me, wiping his hands on a raggedy blue grease rag. "You aren't the only one with mechanical problems. One of my old milking machine's pump motor needed a fixing. He kept wiping his hands on that old rag. I got the feeling he was trying to wipe away more than just grease. Well, I'll be in your way another hour or so. Dispatch says they have a wrecker on the way. Shouldn't be too long. Thank you for letting me borrow your phone. The farmer nodded and pointed towards my unit. Why don't you let me help you get that up to the road so they find you? He said in his hollow voice as he stared off towards the end of his driveway. If it isn't in the way, sir, they could just grab it here. I don't want to make more work for you. But the old man was determined. He started walking to my car. I guess he just assumed, correctly, that I would follow him. They never look in the driveway, so we best push it to the road. I shrugged my shoulders and started to protest, but then thought this was his way of saying, your car is in the way, and I wanted out of my driveway, and just went along with him. As we walked to the car, we passed an old picnic table that was set up under an ancient shade tree. You could just leave your glass there, son. I forgot I was even holding it. I drank the last of it and set it on the splintering tabletop. You get in and steer. I will push you. The old man certainly looked capable of pushing a car, downhill as it were, but I had to protest. I can push while you steer. He stood behind the car, both hands on the trunk and eyes facing forward. There would be no changing his mind. I heaved a sigh and walked to the driver's door. I opened it up and looked back to the old determined farmer. I'll help get it going and then jump in. He just nodded. The driveway was inclined, ever so slightly, and made the pushing easier as we were pushing downhill. As soon as the car was rolling, I jumped in, closed the door, and focused on steering safely to the bottom of the road. I looked into my rear-view mirror, waved, and saw the old farmer turn back to his barn. 45 minutes later, the wrecker pulled up to where I was parked and sitting inside my car at the edge of the road. Dispatch said under 60 minutes, and they were not wrong. The driver of the wrecker opened his door and got out of his truck at the same time I was getting out of my unit to go meet him. Hey man, thanks for getting here so quick. The driver looked up at the farm. We need to hurry with this hookup and get out of here. He seemed nervous, anxious, and spooked. It was evident he was not comfortable being there. Everything's fine. There's no rush. Let's get it done right, and we can get back into town. I assured him as I patted his shoulder and steered us both in the direction of his wrecker. He made short work of getting the cruiser hooked up and ready to tow. We hopped into his truck and headed to the barracks garage. The drive back was a little awkward and silent. He kept looking at me like he couldn't believe I was sitting there and with nothing to say. Patrol units take a beating. These cars have so much use and mileage under their hoods. It's amazing they last as long as they do. Seeing one break down is nothing spectacular. So I was shocked to see an audience when we arrived back at the barracks garage. Everyone was standing around outside looking like they were waiting for bad news after a terrible accident. I stepped out of the wrecker and was immediately bombarded with questions about my big adventure and how I was doing. But the question that really caught my attention was the one everyone kept asking. Did you talk to the old farmer? I did. I wouldn't call him chatty or anything, but he let me use his phone and help push my car to the end of the road. A completely normal response met with a completely abnormal reaction. Eyes as big as saucers and jaws dropped as they processed what I had just said. By now, my car had been released by the wrecker driver, who had come up to join the crowd. Everyone hurried to go look at the patrol car. What's the big deal? I asked the wrecker driver, since he was standing closest to me. We were the only ones who had not followed the crowd to go gawk at my cruiser. You don't know? He looked at me in disbelief, eyes wide and face a little ashen. No, obviously I don't. What's going on? I fought to keep the annoyance out of my voice. I wasn't from around here. I knew the roads of the area, but not the history of the people. He let out the breath he'd been holding. Back in the early 70s sometime, a farmer shot himself in the milking parlor of that old barn. A couple of families tried to start up a dairy farm there, but they didn't last. No one has lived there since the 80s. It's haunted. It looked like he'd given me the worst news a man could hear. I could feel the blood drain from my face. No way, I don't believe it. Even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. Another officer was standing close by as the wrecker driver told me about the farm. Come on, kid, jump in my patrol car and we'll take a drive out there. He was a seasoned officer, probably getting close to retirement. Apparently, he was a paranormal hunter on the side, as a hobby. On the drive out to the old farm, I told him everything that had happened. As we got closer to the old farm, it seemed different. I knew it was the right place. I was just here. But something had changed, and it didn't seem like the same place. As we pulled into the rough driveway, I began to really see the changes, not just feel them. Tree branches had grown down so low they scraped against the patrol car. As we pulled to a stop at the end of the driveway, I was shocked to see the farmhouse and the barn. It was painfully abandoned. Shutters were falling off the house. No paint was left, and the old rocker had fallen in on itself. We got out of the cruiser and walked to the barn. I glanced to the table under the dying shade tree and pointed out the glass I had left there. Inside the barn, a thick layer of dust blanketed every surface. I walked in through the milk parlor door and went straight for the phone. Fresh fingerprints had smudged the layer of dust. My fingerprints. I picked it up from its cradle and listened for a dial tone I instinctively knew wouldn't sound. The silence coming from the phone shook me to my core. I placed it back where I had found it. "We could go now," I told the officer with me. He looked like a kid in a candy store. He had so many questions and wanted to do so much more looking, but he realized how shook I was, and we went back to the barracks. Back at the barracks, we found my cruiser had already been repaired. Luckily, it was nothing major. The positive cable had come off the starter. Simple fix. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked to the back of my car. 2 greasy handprints were on the trunk, exactly where the old farmer had kept his hands as he pushed it. This was several years ago now. I don't work that area anymore, but I've driven back to the old farm because I felt I needed to see it again. The house is gone now. Apparently, the old place was the victim of some arsonist, and it burned to the ground. Even still, being on that land, it gives me the heebie-jeebies.